Say the word commercial in an art crit and watch what happens. Someone's shoulders tense, someone else gets quietly defensive. It's one of the only words in the entire vocabulary of art criticism that can end a conversation before it starts. Not because it's inaccurate, but because it's understood as a verdict. Commercial means sold out. Commercial means safe. Commercial means you did it for the money, not because you meant it. But here's the strange part. For most of art history, that wasn't true at all. Artists were craftsmen. They took commissions. They painted popes and merchants and got paid well for it. And nobody thought less of them for it. So where did this idea come from? That wanting to be paid makes your work suspect. And why does it still have this much power over how we think about creativity today? The word didn't always mean what we think it means. Before the 1800s, there was no real tension between artist and tradesman. A painter was a craftsperson with a guild, a workshop, and a client list. Michelangelo negotiated fees. Rembrandt ran what was essentially a small business, complete with apprentices producing work under his name. Nobody called that selling out. It was just how art got made. The shift happened with Romanticism in the late 1700s and early 1800s. This is the era that invented the idea of the artist as a solitary genius, someone who creates from internal necessity rather than external demand. The scholar Pierre Bourdieu described this as the birth of the autonomous artist, a figure imagined to exist outside the market entirely, driven only by pure vision. It's a seductive image. It's also, Bourdieu pointed out, a little bit of a trick. The idea that great art has to be disinterested in money became, ironically, one of the most effective marketing tools the art world has ever produced. Bohemia made poverty look like proof. The Romantic idea needed a stage, and it got one in Paris. Henri Murger's 1849 book, Scènes de la vie de Bohème, later the basis for Puccini's opera La Bohème, told the story of broke, brilliant young artists living in garrets, choosing art over comfort. It was fiction, but it became a template. Poverty stopped being a circumstance and started being read as evidence. If you were struggling, that meant you were serious. If you were comfortable, people started to wonder what you compromised. Historian Martha Woodman C. has argued that this romantic story did something sneaky. It obscured what was actually happening underneath it, which was a massive structural shift. Patrons, the church, the aristocracy, were disappearing. Artists were being pushed into an open market for the first time, competing for buyers instead of serving one wealthy sponsor. The pure artist above money myth arrived at the exact moment artists needed money more urgently than ever. The timing isn't a coincidence. It's a coping mechanism that calcified into an aesthetic value. Why selling out became the ultimate sin. Fast forward a century, and the same anxiety shows up wearing different clothes. Punk and indie music in the 80s and 90s built entire identities around not selling out, staying on an independent label, refusing corporate sponsorship, keeping your audience small on purpose. Literary fiction developed its own version. MFA programs prizing the difficult, uncommercial novel over the page-turner. Gallery culture rewarded obscurity and punished anything that looked too accessible, too easy to sell. Notice the pattern. In every case, commercial doesn't actually describe the quality of the work. It describes its relationship to an audience. A commercial piece is one that was seemingly made with other people in mind. Their taste, their willingness to buy it, their pleasure. And somewhere along the way, wanting to please an audience got coded as artistically inferior to wanting to please only yourself. The Warhol problem? Then there's Andy Warhol, who is basically the permanent counterexample to all of this. Warhol started as a commercial illustrator, literally drawing shoes for department store ads, before he became one of the most influential fine artists of the 20th century. He never pretended the split between art and commerce existed. He called himself a business artist and said flatly that making money is an art form in itself, that good business is the best art there is. People still bring this quote up like it's shocking decades later because it violates the Romantic script so completely. Warhol wasn't hiding a commercial process behind a mystical one. He put the factory in the name, the factory, and the assembly line silk screening in plain view. And it didn't diminish his work in the eyes of history. If anything, his total honesty about commerce became part of what made his art feel so accurately diagnostic of American culture. He wasn't selling out, he was describing exactly what he saw. The myth doesn't even match the history. Here's the part that should make everyone a little suspicious of the whole framework. The starving artist wasn't even the norm. Plenty of art history's most enduring figures were financially comfortable. Inherited money, wealthy spouses, steady patrons, or straightforward business sense. The idea of a typical artist who suffers nobly in obscurity is a story that got told so often it started to feel like data. It isn't. It's selection bias with good marketing, the same way starving artists, cafes, and movies keep the myth circulating long after it stopped describing reality. Publishing has its own version of this snobbery. If you want to see the commercial versus literary split still playing out in real time, look at how the publishing world talks about its own bestsellers. When a poet like Rupi Kaur sells millions of copies, a chunk of the literary establishment doesn't respond with curiosity about why the work connects with that many readers. It responds with faint embarrassment, as if popularity itself were evidence against depth. The same thing happens with romance and commercial fiction generally. Books that move enormous numbers of copies get treated as a separate, lesser category from literary work, almost by definition, regardless of what's actually happening on the page. This is the exact same romantic logic, just wearing a publishing industry blazer. An MFA program will often reward the difficult, interior, hard-to-market novel over the accessible one, not because difficulty is a reliable marker of quality, but because difficulty looks like seriousness, the same way poverty used to look like proof. Meanwhile, plenty of technically accomplished writers spend a decade producing work that's admired by a handful of critics and read by almost no one, and that outcome gets treated as a mark of integrity rather than what it might also be, a missed connection with an audience that exists and wants that book. None of this means popularity equals quality. Plenty of bestsellers are genuinely thin, and plenty of obscure books are genuinely great. But commercial and literary were never actually opposite ends of a quality scale. They're describing two different relationships to an audience, and only one of those relationships has been allowed to sound respectable. Why? This still matters for you. If you make anything done on essays, videos, novels, art, this old bias is probably still living somewhere in your head, even if you never say it out loud. It shows up as guilt about optimizing a thumbnail. It shows up as hesitation before pricing your work fairly. It shows up as the voice that says a piece doesn't count as real art the second it starts making money. But wanting an audience isn't a betrayal of the work. Caring whether people can actually find, afford, and connect with what you make isn't a lesser form of caring. The Romantic myth needed artists to believe that commerce and meaning were opposites, because that belief kept the market's underlying economics conveniently invisible. You're allowed to reject the myth without rejecting your standards. You can build something that pays you and still means everything. The real distinction was never commercial versus artistic. It was always honest versus dishonest. Whether the work says something true, regardless of who's paying for it or how many people end up loving it. It's worth sitting with why this particular myth has had such staying power. Romantic ideas about suffering artists persist, partly because they're genuinely moving stories, and partly because they're convenient for everyone except the artist. A culture that believes real art requires suffering doesn't have to feel guilty about underpaying its creators. The suffering was supposedly the point anyway. A gallery, a label, or a publisher can pay an artist poorly and still frame it as protecting their integrity. The myth does quiet, structural work that has nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with who keeps the money. So the next time that word shows up in your own head, while you're pricing a Patreon tier, writing a query letter, or deciding whether a video's thumbnail is too commercial, it might help to remember that the discomfort isn't coming from some timeless artistic truth. It's coming from a 200-year-old story that was never fully honest about its own economics. You're allowed to want both things at once. Work that means something, and a way to actually live from it. That was never a contradiction. It just took a very persuasive myth to convince a couple of centuries of artists otherwise.